This is 7 Minutes Cyber with Danny Lawler of Quest and myself, Sam Glynn of Code in Motion. And the 7 minutes start now. In the last episode, myself and Danny were talking about outsourcing risk and cybersecurity risk and how firms can have a blind spot when it comes to other units, intergroup units that they depend on for certain outsourcing activities. And in a similar vein, on this episode, we want to talk about another black spot when it comes to outsourcing, and that is cloud service providers and regtech and fintech SaaS providers. Maybe if you want to kick that off, Danny, and talk about what you've seen in your experience.
Sure. So when you deal with regulated financial services providers and you're thinking about outsourcing, there are some things that are top of the list and then some things that get missed. And the things that tend to get missed are, like we mentioned in the last episode, intragroup outsourcing, but also then outsourcing when it comes to things related to technology, be it regtech, fintech, or cloud service providers. And so it's important to understand that from a regulator's perspective, this is all outsourcing. And so they identify that there are risks associated with outsourcing when it comes to fintech, regtech, CSP, and what have you. And so their expectation is that you apply the same approach when it comes to governance, risk management, business continuity management, when you partner with a regtech firm or a fintech firm, or when you use cloud service providers to store data, whatever it is. You take the same approach as you would if it was setting up an office in another location abroad or whatever. So important to remember that this is all part of the outsourcing arrangements of a firm and gets caught by the expectations on governance and everything around outsourcing.
Yeah, I mean, like I've been thinking about, because I do see that when I'm talking about cybersecurity with firms and we're looking at who do we need to talk to about cybersecurity in their supply chain, and you notice things missing from the outsource register. You know, let's say they use email in the cloud or they use certain services in the cloud, like, I mean, it won't be Dropbox because that's not necessarily an enterprise grade product, but something, that is signed up for just to do some kind of technology, to provide some kind of technology platform. And when we dig into, well, why is that not spotted? Why is that not in the register? I think it's down to when people think about outsourcing, they think about outsourcing processes. Whereas when it comes to tech, maybe some of the SaaS providers outsource, that's providing some kind of process outsourcing. But when it comes to things like email or server in the cloud, you're not outsourcing a process, you're outsourcing a server or you're outsourcing a system. And in a way, people don't, that outsourcing kind of alert doesn't come up to say, oh, hold on a second, this is outsourcing. So I think that's how it doesn't get caught in the standard outsourcing risk and third-party risk management.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's why it tends not to get the focus that it should do from a firm's perspective. But if you look at what the regulators had to say about outsourcing, you look at the discussion paper, they had an excellent discussion paper at the end of 2018, specifically calls out outsourcing in relation to these areas, regtech, fintech, and cloud service providers, as being areas of emerging risk where there are increasing levels of outsourcing. So I think in that paper, they talked about 40% of regulated financial service providers outsourcing to the cloud. That was coming up 2 years ago. I'm sure that number is not less than 40 now. It's probably 50, 60. So they've identified it as being an area of emerging risk and an emerging trend to use these types of service providers. At the moment, actually, the European Commission has just launched a consultation about the use of regtech and how they can promote increasing uses of regtech across the EU. The consultation is open until the end of September. But so you can see that this is where the trend is going. And then it's increasingly important that regulated firms don't forget that this is outsourcing, and you've got to apply all of the things you do to any other outsourcing arrangement to this.
Yeah, I mean, I think EIOPA is another one that recently finalized on their discussions. And again, it's constantly going over the same kind of topics, the clauses that you'd expect to see in a contract, no different than what you'd see in Solvency II, where, it's all about, well, what are you going to do if they can't provide the service levels that you expected? How are you going to know? What are the measures? What are the SLAs? And it's interesting, you kind of go, well, when it comes to IT, a lot of firms have weaker contracts. And in a way, it's nearly, you ask them, well, why have you not nailed these elements, the insolvency bit, the service levels, the losing your data, whatever. And it's nearly an inherent assumption by the clients to say, well, they're tech, so they're going to have the cyber stuff nailed.
Yeah.
And it's, when it's regtech, when it's fintech. when it's even, well-established services, you have to look into the details of the service to see, well, what are they actually committing to providing? And key, what are they not committing to providing? So what are you going to do if they are insolvent? What are you going to do if they have a prolonged outage? And then you're into BCP and kind of business impact, which would tend to be within your, managing third-party risk. But again, if you have that blind spot that you haven't picked up, you're used to cloud and you're used to tech as an outsourcing piece, that won't feed into your third-party management framework. And therefore, you won't start asking those questions until maybe it's a bit too late.
Yeah. And of course, GDPR is never far away from anything that a regulated firm does these days. And it's hugely important here about data security, data protection, where are the servers located, what are the rules in that jurisdiction, what's your access to that data. So all of that feeds into, whenever you use a cloud service provider, you have to go through that whole process of where all of this data is and to understand whether that and those arrangements allow you to meet your obligations under something like GDPR. So it's not as straightforward as it might seem. And the fact that the other side, 6 is it? Yep. The fact that the other side of this deal or this service is a very well-known name that's a massive multinational, it might give you comfort, but it doesn't mean you don't have to ask questions about cybersecurity. I think you're right, Sam. I think that's maybe why sometimes regulated firms, why they put a lot of energy of their outsourcing policies on, units that they've set up abroad and don't so much on tech, is because maybe there's that assumption there, well, surely these guys know about cybersecurity, sure, they would be the best in the world. And
it could well be the case, but you do have to look and say, well, what are they committing to do? So they might be very good at making sure they don't lose your data, but is it in the contract that they're committing to guarantee the data won't be lost? And if it isn't, you got to have a plan. What's the plan B? Get the data out of there, have a backup, whatever it might be. But anyway, again, like the last episode, this is really just a flag, a blind spot that we see with firms, and hopefully those that are seeing this address that blind spot.
And that's our time. That's 7 minutes. So yes, what are the risks? How are you managing, mitigating, eliminating them?
Great stuff. Thanks, Danny.
Thanks, Sam.